Hey, good morning. What I should say, good afternoon, or good morning, or good afternoon, whenever you decide to see this video. Uh, this is for 1302, and this is going to be African American civil rights. It's a timeline, okay? It's not a very detailed timeline. It's more of a synopsis of the important things that happened during the African American civil rights movement. I will be glancing down at my notes every once in a while because I want to make sure that I get everything got adjusted here, everything correct, and make sure that I give you the information that I want. With that said, I hope everybody's doing well, and I promised myself that I wouldn't take more than a minute in the introduction, so we're at a minute. So let's start with the African American uh, uh, timeline, civil rights timeline. As I said before, I believe that the African American civil rights movement began way before uh, Plessy versus Ferguson or Brown v. Board of Education, which was in '54, right? I also believe that Plessy v. Ferguson, and I forget the year that that was passed in, was probably the worst Supreme Court case ever passed or by the Supreme Court. Or I think that it really set us back 100 years in education because African Americans will not be able to have access until the 50s and the 60s to desegregated classrooms. So I think that that was an experiment in social engineering to keep people of color down. Okay. Now, uh, in 1948, Harry Truman desegregates the army. Okay, and that is very important because before that, for the most part, the United States military was segregated. I'm not saying that African Americans were not allowed to fight alongside other individuals, whites or that, but that means that it was segregated. There was a degree of segregation within the U.S. Army. So that was the first thing, and it's also Truman. Under Truman, they come up with a concept of secure these rights. Under the Truman administration, the government finally admits that there is a problem of discrimination and racism and discrimination, but they don't come up with anything to do. They actually passed the Civil Rights Act, I think in 55 or 56, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't have any teeth. Remember, these are civil cases, so because they're civil cases, they don't carry a penalty of jail. They usually carry a monetary or a just an overturning or something, or saying you've got to do this. Okay, so that's another reason why they don't have a lot of teeth. In '54, of course, you have Brown v. Board of Education. Okay, and that's by Thurgood Marshall argues that, and it says that separate but equal is unequal. Just because you have two schools and you send African Americans to school here and white kids to school over here, if this school is better looking and is a nicer school than this one, then that's going to have a psychological impact on the kids that are going to the school that's not as good. And what's going to happen there is that it's going to create a complex. You know, it's an idea where you have kinder to 12th grade in one classroom, or a classroom that is substandard to where, and in classroom I show Mathis High School and then the Mathis Mexican School. Look those up, okay? Because I had a professor that went to the Mathis Mexican High School, and the Mathis regular Anglo-American high school was a really nice and peachy cream school. Now, with that said, a lot of people like to say that Brown v. Board of Education was the big seminal case that really did everything. But remember, we talked at the beginning of the semester. You have Yik Yo, You have Tape Hurley. Oh, look, a mosquito hawk. They decided to come visit me. And then, of course, we have Hernandez v. Texas, also that deals with discrimination. And we have Mendez v. Westminster in California. Okay, so it's not just an African American thing. There's people out there trying to secure rights. And after World War II, Lulac and Hector Garcia, who is a Mexican American, begin to target discrimination and segregation in school because they figure out that if they can get their kids and grandchildren to go to desegregated schools, I'm sorry, then they're going to have an opportunity to become doctors and lawyers and all of the above. In 55, we have, of course, Eisenhower passes, and you see Order 10509, which uh, outlaws discrimination within the federal government. That means that they cannot deny you a job because of the color of your skin. However, we really don't see any big changes until we see the equal opportunity employment uh, 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 apparatus that's put forth by Nixon. In 1955, we also see the murder of Emmett Till, okay, who was murdered because he supposedly whistled or tried to flirt with a white lady. Now, what's so horrific about Emmett Till is the way that he was murdered, okay? The only way that his mother could identify him was by a ring that he wore, okay? And he was, if I'm not mistaken, he was 14 years old. I used to show that film in class, but students just found it too incredibly repulsive to watch. So if you want to watch it, watch it. You should watch it, but there is a disclaimer that it's pretty harsh. Also in 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat in a bus. Now, I will say one thing. There was a lot of people that had refused to give up their seat and had been beaten or put in jail. And I will admit that from what I know, the NAACP set this up, but it was still discrimination, okay? You know, Rosa Parks does become, you know, a hero for African Americans. And what we're going to have is that we're going to have the Montgomery bus boycott, where African Americans are not going to ride the bus. They're not going to go to work. And if they're not going to go to work, then the white community at large is going to have problems because a lot of these individuals worked in domestic jobs. They worked in jobs that had to do with, you know, at the grocery store, dry cleaners and stuff like that. A lot of trash pickup wasn't getting done on time. And it really put a burden on the affluent community that said, no, no, wait a minute. You know what? You need to stop the segregation of the buses because, you know, my work isn't getting done. Okay, 1957, we have the Little Rock Nine, of course, and you know, eventually President Eisenhower sends in federal troops so these kids can go to school. These kids are still with us today. I actually met one of the ladies, I forget her name, but, you know, that is also, and then, of course, Eisenhower passes the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which I talked about earlier. I called it the 56, but it's 57. But it doesn't have any teeth. It's supposed to prohibit voter suppression and, you know, segregation, but there's no teeth to it. It's like they pass these acts or these laws, and there's nothing to hold them accountable with it. In 1960, we begin to see the sit-ins, and that's going to be where African American students refuse to leave restaurants. There's some really horrible pictures on the internet that you can find out, people putting ketchup and sugar on them. But before, and I was actually old enough to go, my grandmother used to go downtown to the pharmacist, and I'd get to have a hamburger at the Woolworth counter. You could go to a grocery store and have a little diner at the counter. And they just wanted to eat like everybody else, you know. Now, a lot of this stuff was being inspired, believe it or not, by individuals, not just Martin Luther King, but in India, Gandhi is promoting a lot of this, you know, movement and equality and freedom, and a lot of students are really picking up on this. Okay, so You have sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. I'm pretty sure it's in North Carolina, and throughout the South. You even had them in Texas and stuff. Of course, in 1960, also Ruby Bridges becomes the first student to integrate into an elementary school. So you have a little girl that is escorted by, if I'm not mistaken, let me see here, federal marshals escort her. Okay. Now, after that in 61, what we begin to see here is you begin to see voter registration movements, and then freedom rides, where individuals would get on a bus in California and they would want to ride it all the way to Mississippi, and they weren't allowed to because in some states they were segregated, so they either had to sit somewhere else or ride in another bus. And they just say, no, we're not going to do this. They were accompanied by a great deal, or not a bunch, but a number of white students, some of them that were white and Jewish. This draws a lot of attention, okay, because eventually this is going to lead up to some violence, okay. In 1963, Governor Wallace, who was a bigot and a racist, one of the most horrible persons that has ever walked on the face of the planet, but at the end he did realize, he did admit and say that he was wrong. Um, where he keeps two African American students from attending the University of Alabama. The standoff continues until John F. Kennedy actually sends in the National Guard and has them guaranteed that they're going to be okay. 1963 also is the March on Washington, where you have 250,000 African Americans attend a memorial, a talk at the Lincoln Memorial, and this is where Martin Luther King does his I Have a Dream speech, which no, isn't all recited. A lot of this was off the cuff. We have to give Martin Luther King for that. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Well, I'm going to strike men, and I'm going to say that all human beings are created equal. So 63 is the March on Washington. Again, in 63, we have the bombing of a church in Birmingham, um, and that creates a lot of anti-protests. In 64, it's going to be a big year with Lyndon Baines Johnson. Okay, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and I'm going to read this. In preventing the employment discrimination due to race, color, sex, religion, or national origin, which also gives us Title VII of the Act that establishes the U.S. Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, okay, EEOC, that is still with us today, that prohibits discrimination in the workplace. And that is very important, okay, because in 65, we're going to have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and that also is going to re-enfranchise a lot of African Americans. But again, remember, these laws don't have any teeth yet. The government is going to use federal funding and stuff like that to make sure that these things are honored. Okay. Unfortunately, 1965 is not a good year. Malcolm X is assassinated. Okay, Malcolm X was the militant side of the movement. Martin Luther King was the peaceful side of the movement. Malcolm X goes to Mecca and he realizes that, hey, you know what? I got it all wrong. Maybe I need to reevaluate this color thing. Of course, he is murdered by members of his own church, and he is shotgunned as he's giving a speech. Of course, that creates a lot of problems. And of course, in March of 1965, we have Bloody Sunday, and there's a bunch of Bloody Sundays in U.S. history, okay? But what we have here is Selma to Montgomery in March, and basically what you have here is local policemen attack the marchers, okay? They get water cannoned and all the above. They actually get thrown in jail, and one of the things that happens is that they realize that they just can't be putting African Americans in jail because it costs money. You know, you got to feed them, you got to take care of them. And now what makes this so incredibly powerful is the power of television. That, you know, this was being played on the news. A lot of people would say, well, look, I really don't want to hang out with African Americans or people of color because because I don't understand them, but you shouldn't treat them like this anyway. And that is very effective in a sense. In 65, I said again, Lyndon Baines signs the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then that is going to cause, what we're going to have there is that they're going to eliminate polling taxes, eliminate that you don't have to be part of a political party membership, that basically all you need to do is walk up and vote. Voter intimidation is outlawed. But then we're also going to have gerrymandering. Look up gerrymandering, because that is very important in as well. In 1968, again, remember I talked about 1968. 1968 is not a good year. By this time, JFK has been assassinated, and in 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated. Okay, and with the assassination of Martin Luther King, the African American civil rights movement does lose a lot of traction, and it loses a lot of traction because what's going to happen is that they're going to become more militant. And as these groups become more militant, they get less help. Nobody likes these issues. You're going to have the watch riots, where an African American gentleman in California is going to be singled out because he was African American. People see him being brutalized, and you have a bunch of rioting that goes on. National Guard is called in. People are shot. I mean, it becomes, a bloodbath in a sense, okay? But 68 is just not a good year. We've got the Tet Offensive. Have the assassin, Robert F. Kennedy comes out and he says, I had a brother shot. African Americans, please don't go out and riot. I feel your pain. But then Robert F. Kennedy is assassinated, after LBJ says that he's not going to run for office. So, as I said before, 68 to 72 or 68 to 76, they're just not, years in the country where you could say that everything is going okay. It's a period of economic, social, and cultural melees. You do have movements that are trying to do things, but African Americans are split because they don't know whether to go on the violent or the non-violent side. The same thing is happening with Mexican Americans. You have the issues of the counterculture. You have Kent State that is coming up. You have the bombing of Cambodia, and of course the quagmire of Vietnam. In 68, President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 68, and what you get there is a Fair Housing Act. That's one of the last things he does. And I am going to give you, if I have time, a little lecture on LBJ and the Great Society and the war on poverty. It's a lot of social programs, the most social programs that we're going to get since FDR. And I think that in a sense is going to be important. Now, I know that somebody is watching this and is saying, oh my God, he left up so much information. He didn't talk about Stokely Carmichael. He didn't talk about the Black Power movement. He didn't talk about the Black Panthers. Well, no, I didn't. I have a limited amount of time to do this. So you have to read on those things. In my opinion, what happens to these movements is the FBI does a really good job of infiltrating these movements, okay? They had a lot of information on Martin Luther King. They get a lot of information. It's called COINTELPRO, and I forget what it all means, but it's COINTELPRO. And they went around gathering information on individuals that were leading these movements. And what ends up happening is that they infiltrate some of these more militant movements, and then they pit them against each other. Now, unfortunately, you're going to have the Black Power movement, and you're going to have a bunch of freedom schools. You're going to have individuals that immerse themselves in African American culture, that begin to look to themselves, that they start celebrating things like Kwanzaa and developing their own music and their own holidays and their own language and stuff like that. They start to move away from the American mainstream and trying to look like Americans and embracing, you know, their own culture. And this is also um, the Black is Beautiful movement. Okay, unfortunately, you know, some of the individuals within those movements, in order to get money, start to sell drugs. There is some questions of whether or not the FBI really did these things. I don't know. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, as most of you know. But eventually, what becomes of a lot of these really militant individuals is that they end up branching out into gangs. And believe it or not, I know that a lot of people were really heavy on Hillary Clinton when she said that gangs offer a sense of family. Well, believe it or not, they do. They offer a sense of community. They offer a sense of protection when these individuals have nothing else. And like I said, 68, 72, 76, 1980, you know, that those are not good years for minorities in California, in inner cities. New York was a mess, you know, so you begin to have, I have a colleague, Selena Vasquez, who tells me, you know, my mother ran a funeral home in Compton, and in the 80s, there was 2 or 3 gang-related funerals a day. You know, we had a we would even make a funeral parlor out of the makeshift funeral parlor out of the garage. And people were killing each other left and right, and I believe that that is a result of the continued disenfranchisement of African Americans and Mexican Americans and poor whites within this movement. I mean, you have a sense of hopelessness. It's all, you know, it is. You can't just say, oh, you know, they were smoking crack and they knew what they were doing. No, it's a sense of that they were joining gangs. They knew better. No, it wasn't that easy. It's not that easy, and we still have those problems now. Okay, I mean, racism is alive and well in the United States. Um, Now, with that said, uh, uh, I'm going to let you go. There will be about, you know, this is going to be probably a little bit bigger of an exam, probably about 60 questions. So there's going to be about, you know, about 20 to 25 questions on the African American civil rights movement. The next one I'm going to do, I don't know, I'll flip a coin. It may be the women's suffrage movement. It may be the Mexican American civil rights movement, but I'm going to give you a little snippet. The African American is the longest, you know, and but I have, and then believe me, I just scratched the surface. But I'm telling you, you know, you need to cover it in your book, and you need to cover it like I outlined it in because you're going to have to go through chapters. Okay. Now, I'm not going to make this much longer because you'll get bored and you won't watch it, or YouTube will get mad at me and want me to pay money. Okay. But I'll see you all later. Be kind to each other, wear your masks, and stay home. I don't care what the governor says. You know, if you don't have to go outside, don't go outside. This pandemic is not a hoax, okay? I actually know 2 people that have passed away from it already and about 6 people that were infected with it, okay? So you all take care. Bye-bye, and I do miss you all very much.